Jean Genet was born in 1910. Our Lady of the Flowers was his first novel, 1942. Here's how it happened. Genet was raised in foster care. By the age of 15, he was in reform school. At 18, he joined the French Foreign Legion. He served in Morocco and Syria. At 24, he was caught having gay sex and was dishonorably discharged. For the next few years, he drifted around Europe, getting busted for theft, prostitution, and having phony papers. By 1937, when he was 27 years old, he was a prisoner at Fresnes prison in the suburbs of Paris. The newspapers of the day were full of the sensational story of Maurice Pilorge, a story much like Genet's own. Reform school, army, desertion, petty crime, prostitution. But it took a different turn. Pilorge killed his lover in a knife fight. He was arrested, he escaped, and after a huge manhunt, he was caught and sentenced to death. Here he is in the courtroom. A guillotine was set up in the prison exercise yard, and at last, justice is done. Yesterday morning at 6:46, Pilorge underwent the supreme penalty. He walks to the scaffold without hesitating, making wisecracks. Genet followed all this intently. At Fresnes, the prisoners were employed in making paper bags out of sheets of brown paper. But instead of making paper bags, Genet used the paper to write on, and what he wrote was Our Lady of the Flowers. A guard found out and confiscated the manuscript. Genet got more brown paper and wrote the novel again, and when he got out in 1942, he took it with him. This was the dedication. But for Maurice Pilorge, whose death never ceases to poison my life, I would not have written this book. I dedicate it to his memory. The title character, Our Lady of the Flowers, is based on Pilorge. The setting is Montmartre, and the people are drag queen sex workers and their pimps. They all go by street names, such as Divine, Darling, and of course, Our Lady of the Flowers. Despite his name, Our Lady is not a drag queen. He is a handsome but not very bright young man, and he is the boyfriend of Divine, a drag queen dying of consumption. The novel opens with Divine's funeral and then proceeds via flashbacks from her childhood right up to her last cough. This is told with abrupt, disorienting leaps back and forth in time, frequently interrupted by Genet speaking in his own voice, reminding us that he is in prison and this is all his masturbation fantasy. Officially, Our Lady is Divine's pimp, but that is more or less a courtesy title because he has nothing to do with the business. Divine does the cruising, Divine collects the money, Divine pays the rent, Divine buys the groceries. In this novel, the pimps are kept men and they are being kept by the queens. On impulse, Our Lady has robbed and killed a John and now is a fugitive. At last, he is arrested and tried. Divine tries to save him. His lawyer tries to save him, but he confesses in open court and rejects mercy. I'd rather croak right away, he says, and once again, a guillotine is set up in the exercise yard. There's lots of sex, graphic sex, in the book, and Genet puts the reader right into bed with Divine and Our Lady and their friends, and sometimes with Genet himself, as he masturbates at Fresnes prison. What you do not see is any of the sex work. The Johns are not part of the fantasy. Genet got out of prison in 1943 into a Paris occupied by the Germans. He managed to get his manuscript to Neutral Monte Carlo, where a tiny edition was published for under-the-counter sales to pornography collectors. In 1944, it was issued properly by the literary journal L'Arbalète, and then in 1948 by the trade publisher Gallimard, and in 1949 in an English translation. Genet continued to write more novels, plays, poems, movies. Jean-Paul Sartre called him Saint Genet. He became famous in international radical politics. Here he is with Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. And I am glad to report that at least for a few years, Genet had a lover, the Moroccan Abdallah Bentaga, a circus tightrope walker. Bentaga died in 1964. Genet died in 1986. John Rechy was a nice young man. He was a college graduate. He did his army service in Germany. By 1955, when he was 24 years old, he was in New York staying at Sloane House, the enormous YMCA hostel on 34th Street, while he studied creative writing at the New School. He was down to his last $20 when a man at Sloane House told him, "If you're really hard up for ready cash, go to Times Square. Always good for 10, good-looking guy like you, just stand there." So he went to Times Square and just stood there, and sure enough, a man appeared and offered him $10. And so began Rechy's effortless career as a hustler, and his writing career as well. In a few years, tales of his hustling adventures were appearing in small literary magazines, and literary agents were pursuing him. He went home to El Paso to write more. As the pages rolled off the typewriter, he read passages to his mom. Eventually, there was enough to make up the 410 pages of City of Night, published by Grove in 1963, and he dedicated it to his mother. In City of Night, hustling is an easy way to make a little extra money. In fact, it looks a lot like plain old cruising. Rechy was supported by the GI Bill, and once the book was published, he was in clover, so he could be choosy about his tricks. The characters in this novel do not get drunk, and they do not use drugs. Heck, they don't even use bad language. They sound like creative writing students. And all the sex occurs off stage. City of Night was a huge international bestseller and not limited to bookstores, as you can see in this Arthur Tress photograph. And the pinup photos of Rechy surely helped sales. But it had its critics. The New York Review of Books assigned it to Alfred Chester, a gay reviewer, with the cruel headline, "Fruit Salad." Chester said it was mostly about the same old queens doing the same old things, swishing and bitching and cruising and falling in love and leaving each other and getting desperate and growing old. Alfred Chester's main complaint was that City of Night was too literary. In fact, the narrator does sound very much like a creative writing student, with lots of fancy prose like this. Like a spurned, persistent lover, the night tries possessively to hug the city, but vainly, sensing the approaching dusk, which already imbues the streets with grayish haze. City of Night has never gone out of print. It is taught in literature courses. Grove celebrated with a 50th anniversary edition in 2013. But if you want to skip the part about how the dusk imbues the streets and just find out what happened, I have good news. Rechy later wrote an autobiography about my life, which has the same stories, often word for word, with less literary padding. It also has some good tales about how he had to escape the attentions of Liberace, Christopher Isherwood, and Allen Ginsberg. About My Life is dedicated, of course, to his mom. John Rechy is still with us, 92 years old now. He has published many books and over a lifetime of teaching has imbued hundreds, maybe thousands of students with the secrets of creative writing. Paul T. Rogers kept his personal life strictly private. He was born in 1936, but I find no details about his life until 1981, when the small literary publisher Pushcart gave him an award and published Saul's book. Pushcart said in an author's note that Rogers had been a school teacher and social worker and knew firsthand the people and places of his startling novel. As it happened, the character Saul in the novel likewise had been a school teacher and social worker. The other major character in the novel is a 16-year-old hustler who goes by the street name Sinbad. Saul and Sinbad are in a complicated relationship, and Saul is thinking about adopting him. In real life, Paul T. Rogers did adopt a 16-year-old boy named Chris and dedicated Saul's book to him. So there seems to be an overlap between fact and fiction here. And in the absence of better information, we have to look to the fictional Saul and Sinbad for clues about the real life Paul T. Rogers and Chris Rogers. The novel is narrated by Sinbad. Sinbad's world is Times Square, which he calls the Deuce. The center is 8th Avenue and 42nd Street, and Sinbad knows all the spots. In a 75-page stream of consciousness, we follow 24 hours of Sinbad's life. Sinbad wakes up in bed with a John in a Fleabag hotel on 43rd Street. He has nothing but 2 Tylenols and an empty methadone bottle. He is getting sick. He rolls the John and splits. It is 6 o'clock, too early to go to the methadone clinic, so he washes the 2 down with a Colt 45 and heads over to the Port Authority bus terminal, where a man gives him a blowjob and $5. Then he goes to the clinic, but the nurse won't give him his medicine because his Medicaid case is closed, so he has to see his parole officer and get a new Medicaid card. But to deal with the parole officer, he needs help from Saul, who knows how to talk to officials. It is still too early in the day to visit Saul, so Sinbad cops 70 milligrams of street methadone. Now he is broke, so he hits the peep show and gets another blowjob and another $5. The methadone is giving him a nice buzz, and now he just wants to smoke a couple of J's and chill out. So he goes to a gangster movie and nods. The movie ends, the lights come up, and he wakes up wondering where he is. It's raining and he wants a hamburger, so he walks over to 12th Avenue and back along 9th. A truck pulls over and Sinbad hops in. Truck drivers are always in a hurry, Sinbad tells us, so I go down on him and jerk him off while I'm blowing him. It don't take him 2 minutes to come. After that, Sinbad does a couple of lines of coke and a couple of joints. Now Sinbad is ready to begin his day. He goes uptown to get Saul's help with the parole officer. Saul is a middle-aged man who speaks in very florid language and uses very big words. He drinks 2 bottles of scotch a day. He has no visible means of support. It seems to have something to do with fencing stolen goods. And a crew of teenage boys is constantly streaming in and out of his apartment. Saul is the nearest thing Sinbad has to a family, the only one he can turn to when he's in a jam. They have a sexual relationship, and they also have a father and son relationship. Whatever you call it, it is love. As the novel goes on and the years go by, Sinbad at last comes to realize this. We need each other. I know it, and he knows it. Him, a pot-bellied old faker, and me, a washed-out hustler. And with that, we leave the fictional Sinbad and Saul in the novel and return to the real-life persons Paul T. Rogers and Chris Rogers. This is what happened in 1985, 4 years after Saul's book was published. Paul T. Rogers was bludgeoned to death by Chris Rogers and Nicholas Ozendrak, a drifter who lived with them. The superintendent of the building where they lived in Rego Park, Queens, found Paul Rogers' body in a closet. He had been dead 10 or 12 days. Paul T. Rogers was 48 years old. Chris Rogers was 19, and Nicholas Ozendrak was 27. Chris Rogers and Nicholas Ozendrak pleaded guilty to murder and also to charges of conspiracy and robbery, and they got long prison sentences. Saul's book has long been out of print, but plenty of copies can be found on used book sites. I suppose that the copyright was inherited by Chris Rogers.